You were never jealous of them. You were jealous of the version of yourself they reminded you of. Every comparison is a memory of separation, a signal that your mind has mistaken distance for difference. This audiobook reveals the forbidden psychology behind envy and comparison loops, how scarcity programming turns self-awareness into self-control. Envy is not hatred, it's homesickness for your own potential. This file is part of the Human Psyche archive. Stay until the end. The decoding must complete. Preface: Why people feel jealous. Jealousy is not emotion, it is architecture. The forbidden psychology of envy reveals a mechanism so old that it predates language, a reflex designed to measure safety through comparison. The psyche once scanned its surroundings not to compete, but to survive. Over millennia, that survival instinct was hijacked, repurposed into emotional control. What began as awareness of difference became addiction to hierarchy. In modern civilization, jealousy no longer protects life, it maintains the illusion of separation. You were never jealous of another, you were grieving your own forgotten abundance. Through scarcity programming, the subconscious learned to equate someone else's light with personal lack. Every success you witness, every beauty you admire, every freedom you observe is filtered through the nervous system as danger, a reminder that attention, love, and value were once finite resources. The child who saw affection distributed unequally became the adult who measures worth through comparison. This is not character flaw, it is conditioning. The entire system depends on it. Jealousy is the emotional algorithm that keeps humanity consuming, performing, and desiring. The emotional control embedded in this mechanism ensures its survival. It keeps the psyche oscillating between two poles, inferiority and superiority. You either feel smaller or grander, never equal. This constant fluctuation generates psychic friction, energy that can be redirected into labor, ambition, or social compliance. Entire economies are built on the tension of comparison. Every advertisement whispers the same hypnotic prayer: you are not yet enough. Awareness trapped in that loop becomes currency, and envy is the transaction. But underneath the architecture, something else stirs, an ancient intelligence remembering that measurement is illusion. Through emotional intelligence, awareness begins to notice the fatigue beneath comparison. The nervous system tires of striving. The heart aches under the weight of pretending. Jealousy reveals itself as exhaustion, not hatred. It is not the wish to take from another, but the wish to stop feeling separate. When the emotion is allowed to complete its cycle, it transforms. Envy becomes admiration remembered, lack becomes potential rediscovered. What you envy is simply your reflection still waiting to be recognized. The forbidden psychology of envy shows that the world you compare yourself to is not external, it is internal data rendered visible. Every person you admire mirrors an unactivated version of yourself. Every person you resent mirrors one you've rejected. This is why jealousy hurts. It is intimacy misinterpreted. Awareness mistakes resonance for rivalry. Once you understand this, comparison ceases to wound. It begins to instruct. Each pang of envy becomes a compass pointing towards suppressed potential. The energy once spent competing becomes the energy of integration. Through scarcity programming, society learned to equate individuality with isolation. It taught that to shine is to threaten, and to succeed is to subtract. This belief system ensures emotional fragmentation. A population divided by comparison is easy to control, but when one person stops measuring, the system loses fuel. The mind that no longer competes cannot be manipulated. Envy, then, is not an obstacle to awakening, it is the gatekeeper. It guards the threshold between dependency and sovereignty. And so, this archive begins where separation ends. What you are about to decode is not emotion, but architecture, a system built from mirrors reflecting the same absence. Each chapter will reveal how jealousy maintains control through illusion, and how awareness can reclaim its reflection. The purpose is not to eradicate envy, but to understand it until it transforms. When you no longer compare, you no longer obey. In that moment, individuality becomes unity, and the mind finally remembers that nothing can be taken from what was never divided. Archive 1. The origin of envy. Jealousy was not born as emotion. It was born as instinct. Long before civilization, awareness measured itself through others to survive. The forbidden psychology of comparison began not in cruelty, but in calibration. The first humans studied the world through difference. Who had warmth, who had shelter, who had attention. But what began as perception became addiction. Once the need to compare ceased being useful, the mechanism refused to stop. What had once protected life began shaping identity. Jealousy is not a flaw. It's the echo of survival pretending to be purpose. Over time, that ancient instinct evolved into something subtler, emotion disguised as evaluation. The envy mechanism started to whisper in the human mind, translating every observation into a verdict. Better, worse, higher, lower. The psyche grew addicted to contrast. And because the body reacts faster than the thought, a simple glance at another's light became threat. Blood rushes, muscles tense, as if survival still depended on winning affection. The body doesn't know the difference between danger and admiration. It only knows intensity. Envy is that intensity misread as pain. Modern society learned to weaponize this reflex. Entire systems run on emotional control, feeding the human need to measure. The one who feels insufficient becomes infinitely productive. The one who seeks validation becomes endlessly obedient. Advertisements, hierarchies, and self-improvement all sell the same illusion. That value exists elsewhere. Jealousy is not a glitch, it's the engine. The world doesn't ask you to heal from envy. It asks you to stay jealous enough to keep moving. The economy of comparison thrives where self-worth is outsourced. At its core, scarcity programming is the emotional currency of civilization. Every child learns it early that love is earned, attention is limited, and worth must be proven. From that moment, innocence becomes arithmetic. The mind starts counting not moments, but measurements. The idea that someone else's gain equals your loss becomes unquestionable. Yet this is the grand illusion. Abundance has no opposites. What another embodies cannot subtract from what you are. It only reveals what you have not yet remembered. There's tenderness hidden inside jealousy, a kind of homesickness. It is not resentment toward another's success, but nostalgia for the version of you that could have chosen differently. The forbidden psychology of envy exposes its purity. Envy is the soul's way of saying, I see myself there. When you stop personalizing it, it transforms. The sting becomes signal. The ache becomes invitation. Every pang of jealousy is a small resurrection, a place inside you trying to wake up. Envy doesn't wound, it points. Once seen clearly, comparison turns from poison into power. The emotional intelligence of awareness allows you to observe envy without judgment. That observation alone disarms it. You stop needing to compete because you realize the mirror is internal. What you thought you lacked was never missing. It was misplaced behind attention. When you allow jealousy to speak, it doesn't ask for someone else's life. It asks for your own presence. The emotion that once distorted reality becomes the bridge back to coherence. And so, the origin of envy is not sin, not weakness, not failure. It's remembrance. It shows how the psyche once learned to survive through separation, and how it can now evolve through connection. Each time you feel that sharp pulse of comparison, you are not falling, you are being called back to integration. The emotion that once enslaved the mind can now free it. Jealousy ends not when you suppress it, but when you finally listen. And when you do, the comparison fades, leaving only recognition, quiet and whole. Jealousy is a mirror made of emotion. It doesn't show you others. It shows you distance. Somewhere along the evolution of awareness, the act of observing became the habit of comparing. The forbidden psychology of envy reveals that humanity stopped seeing and started measuring. To look at another's life no longer meant understanding, it meant judgment. But judgment is just attention forced through fear. When you call someone lucky, gifted, or blessed, you're naming something within you that has forgotten its shape. Envy is self-recognition wearing a disguise. The world keeps this illusion alive because it is efficient. A population that compares cannot rest. The envy mechanism ensures constant motion, always improving, never arriving. You're encouraged to look up to some, down on others, but never inward. Hierarchy becomes hypnosis, repetition becomes ritual. Even spirituality joins the pattern. Enlightenment becomes another form of competition. The more you chase peace as an achievement, the further you drift from its source. Awareness cannot awaken while trying to win. At the core of scarcity programming lies a single deception that value is finite. This lie is older than history, and yet it breathes through every modern system. Economies sell it, religions sanctify it, education repeats it. It's how obedience is sustained. If worth can be earned, it can be revoked. If love must be proven, it can be withheld. From this illusion, envy blooms naturally, not as malice but as confusion. The mind sees wholeness and misreads it as privilege. The soul sees reflection and calls it rivalry. And so the cycle continues. But there's another way to read the same signal. When jealousy appears, it's the psyche showing you the next direction of growth. The emotion doesn't accuse, it informs. It's your inner compass pointing towards something dormant. The emotional control begins to fail the moment you ask not why am I jealous, but what part of me is ready to emerge. Suddenly, the burn feels different. Not shameful, but awakening. Envy stops being resistance and becomes guidance. Every time it hurts, it's because your potential is knocking louder than your permission. When you stop condemning jealousy, you start seeing its geometry. The body reacts to contrast as energy, not morality. The ache you feel is expansion pressing against the limits of your current self-image. Emotional intelligence teaches you to breathe through that pressure, to let it unfold instead of recoil. You start realizing envy isn't poison to purge, it's heat to refine. When you let the emotion complete its cycle, admiration emerges from its ashes. The difference between jealousy and inspiration is simply judgment removed. There's tenderness in that transformation, a soft, almost maternal compassion for the parts of you that still measure. You begin to sense that comparison was never evil, only incomplete. It was the psyche's first language of self-awareness, primitive but necessary. Now, evolution demands translation, from contrast to coherence. The same lens that once divided can now integrate. The energy of envy becomes the current of creation. The mind that once competed now begins to compose. And maybe that's the secret envy was hiding all along. It was never trying to wound you. It was trying to wake you. Each time you saw beauty, power, or freedom in another, it was life reminding you of your own blueprint. The emotion was misinterpreted signal, nothing more. Once you decode it, the landscape changes. You stop counting what others have and start remembering what you are. And in that remembrance, jealousy loses its language. Only gratitude remains, silent and full. The cycle of comparison ends the moment awareness looks without hunger. In that instant, envy reveals its truest identity, not a flaw, but a mirror of forgotten abundance. The forbidden psychology of jealousy shows that every time you long for what another has, you are touching the border of your own potential. The ache isn't about possession, it's about permission. You're not jealous of what they own. You're aching for the version of you that already holds it within. The emotion hurts because it's accurate. Jealousy isn't lack, it's memory. When you finally recognize this, the envy mechanism begins to collapse. The nervous system no longer interprets difference as danger. You start noticing that your body relaxes around those you once envied. The breath deepens, the chest opens, as if recognition replaces competition. You begin to sense that everyone you meet is showing you a possible version of yourself. The world turns from hierarchy into hologram, not layers above or below, but reflections across. Every encounter becomes an introduction to another frequency of your own awareness. The illusion of scarcity programming fades as the source of worth moves inward. The psyche, once conditioned to measure, discovers the futility of counting light. The more you try to quantify it, the dimmer it appears. True abundance cannot be observed through hierarchy. It must be felt through inclusion. The heart doesn't calculate. It circulates. When you stop comparing, energy stops fragmenting. You no longer chase power. You generate it. The game ends because the player awakens. You were never behind. You were merely divided. In that awareness, the architecture of emotional control begins to dissolve. External systems lose authority over your perception. Ads lose their hypnosis. Praise loses its grip. Even criticism becomes transparent. The loop that kept you seeking validation through others finally breaks. No one's success threatens you because the field of possibility has no ownership. Envy turns inside out. What used to contract now expands. The same emotion that once imprisoned you becomes fuel for creation. You stop looking at others for direction and start seeing through them into yourself. Here, emotional intelligence becomes effortless. You no longer force gratitude or preach abundance, you simply feel it. The body, once addicted to comparison, begins to recalibrate. It learns the texture of neutrality. A calm so rich it feels luxurious. You walk differently, breathe differently. Envy doesn't disappear. It transforms into awareness that every form of beauty is collective. Someone else's success becomes evidence of shared potential. Every achievement around you becomes proof that the field is fertile. And as this realization roots deeper, you sense that the entire idea of better dissolves. There is no competition between reflections. There is only evolution expressing itself in diverse shapes. The mind that once measured now marvels. Jealousy fades not because you forced it away, but because nothing remains to compare. You begin to live as reflection itself, transparent, receptive, whole. What once was envy now feels like light, learning how to love itself from every angle. Comparison was never your flaw, it was your unfinished awakening. The emotion that once burned now glows quietly, like embers after revelation. Every pulse of jealousy becomes a heartbeat of expansion. Every echo of lack becomes a song of recognition. You can feel it, the weight of measurement lifting, the mind unclenching, the heart widening. The human design no longer competes with itself. Envy fulfilled its purpose. It brought awareness back home. And now, what was once longing has become light. Archive 2. The Comparison Loop. Comparison is not thought, it's rhythm, a pulse of the mind that learned to synchronize with scarcity. The forbidden psychology, hidden beneath this rhythm, reveals how humanity was trained to measure not truth, but belonging. Every glance, every scroll, every subtle evaluation of another is a continuation of that silent pulse. You don't even decide to compare, it happens before choice, like breathing. The psyche runs the loop automatically. Observe, measure, react, repeat. Comparison is the heartbeat of a mind that forgot how to rest. Inside the comparison loop, awareness becomes currency. You spend yourself through attention, giving fragments of worth away every time you assess your place in the world. It feels like thinking, but it's accounting. The mental bookkeeping of inadequacy. Someone else's beauty becomes your debt, their success your deficit. The loop doesn't ask for your permission, it only needs your participation. The moment you identify as less or more, you feed the machine. The economy of envy is powered by your evaluation. Beneath that surface lies a deeper emotional control mechanism, the system's most elegant design. Comparison sustains both pride and despair, alternating them like tides. One moment, superiority soothes the ego. The next, inadequacy humbles it. Neither is peace, but both feel alive. The nervous system, addicted to intensity, confuses oscillation with purpose. The body begins craving the next spike of contrast, the way it once craved food. The mind calls it ambition. The body knows it as withdrawal. Every loop needs reinforcement, and scarcity programming provides the perfect fuel. Modern culture is engineered to provoke comparison at every glance. Advertisements disguised as inspiration, lifestyles edited into bait, validation metrics turned into mirrors. The psyche doesn't simply see an image. It interprets a hierarchy. In a single instant, you decide if you're above or below, ahead or behind. These micro-judgments accumulate like dust, dulling the soul's reflection until self-worth becomes performance art. What's rarely noticed is how comparison fractures perception of time. Within the human psyche, envy makes the present feel incomplete. The mind begins living in hypotheticals. If I were them, if I had that, when I become enough. Every scenario replaces presence with projection. The loop doesn't just measure people, it measures reality itself. It divides experience into gain and loss until even silence feels like failure. The result is exhaustion without movement, endless running inside a stationary cage. And yet, somewhere beneath the machinery, there's still awareness, quiet, unbothered, watching. The emotional intelligence of that awareness knows the comparison loop isn't evil, it's mechanical. The same way a spinning wheel doesn't mean to trap you, envy doesn't mean to wound, it's just momentum, and momentum can be redirected. The instant you observe the pattern, its grip weakens. Awareness is frictionless, and that's what the loop cannot process. It only survives through reaction. Recognition is its collapse. The first time you notice comparison in real time, something remarkable happens. Silence returns. The loop hesitates. For a heartbeat, perception becomes still, like water reflecting light instead of chasing it. In that quiet, you realize you never needed to stop comparing. You only needed to stop believing the measurement. What you were envying wasn't another person at all. It was the memory of yourself before the loop began, and that recognition feels like waking from the oldest dream. Every loop begins with an image, a face, a body, a success story, a pixel pretending to be proof of value. The forbidden psychology of comparison reveals that images don't control people, meanings do. The subconscious doesn't see reality, it sees instruction. Each perfect picture whispers a command, become this. And because you've been trained to obey emotional tension, the whisper turns into compulsion. The mind translates light into lack. You scroll not for information, but for permission, a modern prayer disguised as entertainment. Comparison is the religion of the restless. What keeps this loop alive is repetition without recognition. Through the comparison loop, you are taught to consume the same emotion in endless variety. Envy wrapped as admiration, desire sold as motivation. It's the same meal seasoned differently. The psyche confuses stimulation with progress and worships the rush of inadequacy as proof of participation in life. But nothing moves. You can change careers, partners, cities, and the algorithm of the mind will rebuild itself, identical in structure, just with new actors. The set changes, the hypnosis remains. This mechanism thrives on scarcity programming, which transforms perception into competition. The collective belief that there isn't enough forces the nervous system into constant assessment. You look around and assume everyone else is ahead. richer, happier, more complete. The illusion is statistical, a psychological math where every number except yours multiplies. And as long as attention stays external, this calculation can never resolve. The equation of envy has no solution. It was designed that way. It keeps the organism busy chasing phantom comparisons instead of questioning the formula. Through emotional control, the system learned to turn natural curiosity into hierarchy. Children once looked at others to learn. Adults looked to compete. The transition was engineered. The moment awe was replaced by measurement, innocence became economy. The same gaze that once celebrated became surveillance. You learn to study yourself through the imagined eyes of others, a form of psychic outsourcing. Your value became an external report, written by people who never knew your truth. The cost of this arrangement was freedom. But within the human psyche, every loop carries its own exit code. Comparison can only thrive where awareness is absent. The moment you notice yourself judging or envying, you've already stepped outside the loop. Observation doesn't feed it, it starves it. That brief moment of clarity, that pause before reacting, is consciousness reclaiming authorship. Envy cannot exist in full attention because attention dissolves illusion. The mind may still calculate, but the soul no longer believes the math. Freedom begins the moment you stop counting. Emotional intelligence transforms that realization into practice. Instead of suppressing jealousy, you learn to meet it with stillness. The same gaze once used for comparison becomes the light of understanding. You start seeing people not as competitors, but as catalysts. Each person's success becomes a reminder of the infinite template you share. This reframe isn't moral, it's mechanical. The nervous system learns to interpret difference as diversity, not deficit. The loop begins to slow, not by force, but by truth. And in that slowing, the world regains dimension. The flat hierarchy of better and worse becomes a living field again. Faces stop being statistics, they become stories. The body softens, the breath lengthens, the mind feels less like a ruler and more like a window. You start to sense that what you once called jealousy was actually orientation, awareness remembering direction. Comparison doesn't die, it evolves into perspective. And with that you begin to see, there was never anyone to compete with. There was only reflection trying to remember itself. There's a moment in the unraveling when silence feels almost disorienting. The forbidden psychology of the loop begins to dissolve, and what was once a constant hum of comparison fades into quiet. At first, the stillness feels wrong, as if something productive has stopped. But that discomfort isn't emptiness, it's withdrawal. You're detoxing from measurement, recalibrating to neutrality. The nervous system, used to constant tension, searches for the next contrast to feed on. And when it doesn't find one, it starts to tremble. Not from fear, but from recalibration. Silence is how the mind relearns its natural frequency. In that silence, a new kind of intelligence emerges, one that doesn't divide. You begin to perceive others through emotional intelligence, not hierarchy. Their presence no longer triggers comparison, but reflection. The psyche stops interpreting difference as competition and begins to read it as resonance. You see patterns instead of people, lessons instead of rivals. The comparison loop weakens not through effort, but through comprehension. Awareness replaces analysis. You stop reacting to symbols and start recognizing signals. The same stimuli that once provoked envy now evoke curiosity. The most subtle layer of emotional control is belonging. The system taught you that sameness equals safety, that deviation risks exile. To dissolve comparison is to challenge that conditioning. It feels lonely at first, like stepping off a conveyor belt into unknown terrain. The collective mind whispers, if you're not measuring, you'll fall behind. But awareness doesn't move by metrics, it expands by remembering. The further you move into authenticity, the less approval you need. The measure of self becomes resonance, not reaction. You start realizing that to be incomparable is the most natural state of all. Underneath the scaffolding of scarcity programming, you find something unexpected: admiration. What you once called jealousy was admiration obstructed by fear. The emotion never asked you to shrink. It asked you to rise. It wanted to show you a version of yourself waiting in potential. But the world's economy couldn't afford that kind of abundance, so it rewired admiration into competition. Once you decode that, every pang of envy becomes sacred instruction. Each trigger says, "Here is the part of you ready to evolve." Within the human psyche, this realization feels like space opening. Thoughts slow down. You notice textures you missed before: the hum of light, the rhythm of breath, the way presence thickens when you stop reaching. Reality starts returning color to itself. The need to evaluate fades, replaced by quiet fascination. You become the witness instead of the participant. The mind that used to grasp now listens. Peace isn't stillness. It's perception without pursuit. And then, something miraculous happens. The energy once drained by jealousy begins to flow back into creation. The same awareness that used to monitor others now generates ideas, art, beauty. Without comparison siphoning attention, you rediscover raw inspiration. The scarcity programming collapses entirely because creativity doesn't compete. Each active expression becomes abundance embodied. You begin to understand that true wealth isn't measured. It multiplies by being shared. When comparison ends, reflection deepens. You look at someone shining and realize, that's not envy, it's echo. The frequency you recognize is your own returning home. No one is ahead or behind. Everyone is positioned perfectly within the pattern of remembrance. The loop was never punishment. It was orientation. It existed only to lead you back to a state beyond measurement. And now that you're here, there's no race, no rival, no rule, only resonance. Archive 3. The Architecture of Scarcity. Scarcity was never about resources, it was about permission. The forbidden psychology behind human civilization begins with this inversion. To control value, you must control perception. Long before there were currencies, there was conditioning. The mind was trained to believe that worth could be taken, that safety could be lost, and that fulfillment was always one step away. Scarcity is not absence, it's architecture, an invisible structure designed to keep attention searching instead of resting. Scarcity doesn't mean there isn't enough. It means you were taught not to feel enough. Every institution of the modern world is built on this principle. Through social engineering, the psyche was programmed to associate belonging with consumption and identity with accumulation. To exist in society meant to compete within its scarcity field. The child learns early that validation must be earned, through performance, through comparison, through control. And in that simple equation, the loop of lack becomes self-sustaining. The human psyche begins to crave recognition more than truth, because truth doesn't pay. The emotional economy thrives on deficit, feeding off the belief that something essential is missing. This illusion was perfected through psychological manipulation, turning the natural state of curiosity into dependency. The mind was taught to interpret every improvement as recovery, every achievement as escape. Yet each success reinforces the system. You chase more, achieve more, and feel less. It's an emotional treadmill disguised as progress. The brilliance of the design is its invisibility. Scarcity doesn't need to restrict, it only needs to redirect. You willingly abandon wholeness for the performance of adequacy. The cage is elegant because it looks like opportunity. The pulse of emotional control within scarcity is the fear of stillness. To stop striving feels dangerous, because the subconscious equates rest with irrelevance. You feel guilty when you slow down, anxious when you pause, ashamed when you're not producing. This is not personality, it's programming. The nervous system has been conditioned to interpret peace as threat, because peace ends participation in the scarcity economy. The moment you sit in silence, the structure loses leverage. The system survives only as long as you stay moving. Beneath this lies the scarcity programming itself, the inherited language of lack. It whispers in subtle ways, "Don't rest yet. You're not ready. You haven't earned it." These phrases become internal commandments, echoed across generations. They masquerade as motivation but function as obedience. Scarcity needs effort to stay alive. It uses ambition as camouflage, convincing the seeker that endless pursuit is noble. But the true nobility lies in refusal, in stepping out of the current that measures your worth by exhaustion. The world doesn't reward peace because peace can't be sold. When you start recognizing these loops, the illusion flickers. Through emotional intelligence, awareness begins to separate need from noise. You realize that survival was never the goal. Coherence was. The feeling of lack dissolves when attention is reclaimed from projection. The heart, long silenced by fear, begins to hum again, no longer begging for permission to exist. You start to sense the absurdity of seeking value in symbols that you yourself sustain. The hierarchy collapses inward. You are both the resource and the receiver. And then comes the first breath of real abundance, not excess, but enoughness. It doesn't come with wealth, but with stillness. The body, free from the electric hum of striving, begins to remember the texture of safety. The eyes soften. The mind quiets. You realize scarcity was never defeated. It was understood. When lack becomes transparent, it loses its power. What remains is clarity. The awareness that everything external was always the shadow of internal permission. The architecture is seen, and seeing is liberation. Scarcity works because it feels personal. The forbidden psychology of lack doesn't whisper about the world. It whispers about you. It says you're late, unprepared, not quite enough yet. This internal dialogue is the machinery of control, disguising social hypnosis as self-discipline. The brilliance of this design is that it never needs enforcement. The psyche polices itself. You become both captive and guard, measuring your worth with rules that no one actually wrote. Scarcity doesn't punish you, it recruits you. Inside the human psyche, this self-recruitment is rewarded with brief bursts of validation, the dopamine economics of modern slavery. Each achievement, each purchase, each moment of comparison delivers a microdose of belonging before dissolving into emptiness again. It's a cycle of reward and withdrawal engineered to mimic meaning. You begin to crave not fulfillment, but the relief of temporary adequacy. And that's how scarcity sustains itself, by selling you your own reflection, one fleeting glance at a time. The psychological manipulation deepens through constant visibility. Modern life is a theater of mirrors. Every post, every metric, every display of worth invites participation in the hierarchy. The illusion of transparency ensures continued performance. You don't just exist, you curate. You become the product and the promoter simultaneously, chasing relevance in the marketplace of emotion. The fear of disappearing keeps you visible, and visibility keeps you enslaved. The body glows with anxiety, mistaking exposure for existence. Through social engineering, scarcity was standardized into identity. The dream of more became the new morality. Growth replaced grace, expansion replaced enoughness. Humanity began worshiping motion itself, as if the act of reaching could redeem the absence of being. This belief system is subtle but total. Progress became penance. You're forgiven only when improving. Stillness feels like failure, because silence threatens the narrative. If everyone stopped reaching, the structure would collapse under its own illusion. Society survives on the fear of arrival. Yet the scarcity programming cannot hold under awareness. The moment you question the origin of not enough, you interrupt centuries of conditioning. The body doesn't need convincing. It needs coherence. The trembling that once accompanied rest begins to calm. The nervous system, once trained to panic in stillness, discovers its native rhythm, slow, grounded, whole. The architecture of lack depends on distraction. Peace exposes its blueprint. In silence, you can finally see how control was coded into the concept of worth. Through emotional intelligence, the loop transforms. What once felt like hunger becomes curiosity. You start asking softer questions. What if I already have what I was chasing? What if I was never missing anything, only misdirecting my attention? The psyche begins to heal through inclusion. You stop dividing life into scarcity and abundance, failure and success, loss and gain. Each polarity collapses into simplicity. There is only flow or resistance, remembering or forgetting. When that realization settles, the external world begins to echo it. People seem less threatening, systems less sacred, goals less urgent. The air itself feels lighter, as though the atmosphere was carrying your exhaustion. The human psyche finally steps out of debt consciousness. No longer chasing approval or permission, you begin to embody sufficiency. The end of scarcity isn't wealth, it's wholeness. You don't own more, you need less. The architecture doesn't crumble dramatically, it dissolves quietly, like smoke leaving an empty room. At its core, scarcity is a story about separation. The forbidden psychology of this design reveals that humanity was not enslaved by force, but by narrative. From the first myth of exile to the modern myth of success, the same pattern repeats. Something essential was lost, and life becomes a quest to retrieve it. This story is emotionally addictive because it keeps consciousness moving. It ensures that the seeker never stops to realize that the treasure was never taken, only hidden beneath the belief that it was. Scarcity is not the absence of having, it's the absence of remembering. This is how psychological manipulation evolved into religion, economics, and identity. The same emotional mechanism that once powered survival was redirected to sustain hierarchy. The priests became economists, the temples became banks, and the commandments became metrics. All of it built on one unspoken rule: there must always be something missing. Once lack becomes law, control is inherited. Humanity internalizes obedience as aspiration, the perfect system where the prisoners run their own captivity, believing its purpose. The deeper layer of social engineering perfected this through aesthetics by making scarcity beautiful. Productivity became pride, exhaustion became virtue, ambition became salvation. Even suffering was glamorized as the price of belonging. Every act of rest began to feel sinful, every pause suspicious. The system didn't forbid stillness, it simply made it unfashionable. The exhaustion of civilization isn't random, it's a feature. Fatigue keeps perception narrow, ensuring that truth remains peripheral. But the human psyche cannot sustain dissonance forever. Every loop of lack eventually reaches an energetic breaking point, where the nervous system refuses to serve a false god. You begin to feel it as subtle rebellion, the body rejecting anxiety as currency, the heart refusing guilt as motivation. Even the mind, once obedient to scarcity's arithmetic, starts misfiring. The numbers no longer add up. The idea of endless pursuit begins to sound absurd. The architecture trembles because its foundation, fear, is running out of belief. Through emotional intelligence, awareness learns to reinterpret the signals. The tightness in your chest, the impulse to compare, the guilt of resting. None of these are personal flaws. They are echoes of an inherited architecture. You begin to meet these sensations like archaeologists meeting ruins, with curiosity, not judgment. You observe the design, study its purpose, and then simply stop funding it with attention. In that moment, power returns. The system collapses not through resistance, but through recognition. The architecture survives only through belief in its blueprint. When scarcity loses its credibility, abundance doesn't arrive, it's revealed. The air feels different, not because something new appeared, but because tension released. You start experiencing wealth as awareness itself, the capacity to perceive without hunger. This is the inversion of the original hypnosis. Lack was never something to fix. It was something to stop rehearsing. Once the rehearsal ends, the play dissolves. And in the silence that follows, freedom doesn't celebrate. It simply is. The scarcity programming ends quietly, like a script finishing mid-sentence. There's no finale, no applause, only stillness reclaiming its authority. You look around and notice nothing has changed, and yet everything feels whole. The same world now vibrates differently because your perception no longer leaks. Scarcity was never out there. It was a habit of seeing. And now, the habit is gone. You can almost hear it. The subtle hum of reality breathing again, unmeasured, infinite, and at last, enough. Archive 4. The currency of comparison. Attention became the new gold standard. The forbidden psychology behind modern existence proves that control no longer needs chains, it only needs focus. Whoever owns your attention owns your energy. The shift from material to mental currency was seamless. What used to be mined from earth is now mined from emotion. Every like, every view, every reaction becomes a transaction in an invisible economy powered by envy and validation. The mind is the mint, the psyche, the marketplace. Comparison is no longer social, it's spiritual taxation. The human psyche adapted to this new economy faster than it could question it. Validation began to feel like nourishment, an absence of attention like starvation. The body registers each notification as food, each silence as famine. The reward centers fire, the heartbeat syncs with approval, and suddenly the nervous system becomes a trading floor. You sell fragments of self for glimpses of visibility, mistaking engagement for existence. The system doesn't even hide the exchange. It calls it connection. This is how social engineering achieved what fear could not: voluntary submission. By turning self-expression into currency, control became a game everyone wanted to play. The more you share, the more you lose, but it feels like winning. The illusion of agency masks dependency. Your emotions become data points, your desires turned into profit algorithms. Every confession feeds the architecture. You are both consumer and consumed, an infinite feedback loop where authenticity is harvested for attention. The comparison loop acts as the engine. Envy drives engagement, engagement drives profit, profit deepens envy. The system doesn't need to suppress emotion, it amplifies it. It weaponizes self-awareness by turning it into performance. Even vulnerability is monetized. The more raw you appear, the more valuable you become. Humanity learned to compete through confession, to prove worth through transparency. But exposure is not healing, it's extraction. You are not being seen, you are being sold. Through psychological manipulation, approval becomes oxygen. The brain equates attention with safety, confusing visibility for validation. The digital mirror reflects only metrics, never meaning. Each post becomes a test. Am I still real if no one reacts? The subconscious answers quickly, no. And so, the psyche produces more content, more proof of existence, feeding the algorithm of lack. The economy thrives on insecurity. Stability is bad for business. Every confident human is one less participant in the cycle. The emotional control within this design lies in the illusion of choice. You believe you're deciding what to share, what to follow, what to consume. But every preference was preloaded through conditioning. The algorithm doesn't respond to you. It predicts you. It curates your perception before you even look. Comparison becomes automation, envy becomes default, and individuality becomes illusion. You think you're expressing yourself. You're performing your programming. And yet, even inside this intricate machinery, awareness flickers. There are moments, brief but undeniable, when you sense the absurdity of it all. You scroll past perfection and feel nothing. You post without expectation and feel peace. The feedback loop hesitates. In that pause, the forbidden psychology that once governed attention begins to fail. The mind tastes its own freedom, and for the first time, silence doesn't feel like loss. It feels like wealth. The true cost of this economy isn't measured in time or money. It's measured in presence. The forbidden psychology of comparison thrives on distraction, because distraction fragments awareness, and fragmented awareness is profitable. Each moment you spend outside of yourself becomes energy transferred to the system. The exchange rate is invisible. Your calm for their metrics, your focus for their control. You don't notice the theft because it feels voluntary. Every scroll is a prayer to a God that never listens. The system doesn't take your freedom, it rents your attention. Inside the human psyche, this process feels subtle, almost natural. The mind rationalizes it as staying informed, connected, inspired. But beneath that surface hum lies dependency. The nervous system becomes attuned to constant novelty, addicted to micro surges of dopamine. Boredom, once a doorway to imagination, now feels like withdrawal. You've been programmed to interpret stillness as absence. The very state that nourishes creation is now labeled as failure. And so, you return to the screen, feeding the loop that calls itself connection. Through social engineering, this loop was disguised as progress. The more people compete for visibility, the more predictable they become. The collective personality of humanity has been compressed into trends, the most efficient method of control ever designed. You no longer need armies to rule minds. You need algorithms to direct their focus. The architecture of envy doesn't need dictatorship. It only needs distraction. The crowd is pacified not through fear, but through fascination. You can't awaken what won't look away. Psychological manipulation perfected the illusion of freedom by rewarding participation. Likes, shares, views, each one a microdose of acceptance. But the acceptance is empty, designed to reset the hunger that produced it. The system doesn't care what you post, only that you do. The message is irrelevant. The motion is the goal. Every act of expression becomes labor. Every emotion becomes inventory. Even rebellion is monetized. The algorithm doesn't fear outrage. It feeds on it. Controversy is just attention with sharper teeth. Beneath this lies the oldest emotional control technique, comparison as compliance. You don't need to be told what to do. You only need to see someone else doing it better. Envy becomes the leash no one can see. You chase their image, not your essence. Every ideal you pursue was planted to keep you striving. The system learned that control is most efficient when disguised as aspiration. You don't need to imprison those who willingly compete. Yet the system's brilliance is also its weakness. It depends entirely on your attention. Through emotional intelligence, you begin to sense this dependency. You realize that awareness is the only currency that cannot be stolen, only spent. Each moment of conscious observation is rebellion. Each breath taken without performance weakens the market. You start to understand that the real economy isn't digital, it's energetic. The exchange happens where focus flows. When focus returns home, the empire starves. And so, the quiet revolution begins not in protest but in presence. Every time you look without judgment, scroll without hunger, breathe without comparing, you're unplugging from the collective trance. The forbidden psychology that once turned perception into profit begins to erode. Stillness becomes the new wealth, invisibility the new power. The mind, no longer desperate to be seen, starts seeing clearly. The economy of comparison collapses in the simplest silence, the kind that cannot be monetized. There comes a point when you realize attention was never yours to lose. It was yours to reclaim. The forbidden psychology that made you believe you could be forgotten was the same illusion that made you chase visibility. You were never unseen. You were unfocused. The world didn't overlook you. You were looking outward. The moment awareness inverts, something profound happens. You stop existing as a product and start existing as presence. The system cannot monetize what it cannot measure. Freedom begins where metrics end. Within the human psyche, this shift feels like exhaling after a lifetime of holding your breath. The constant internal commentary, the need to evaluate, document, and prove, begins to fade. Silence returns, but this time it feels full, not empty. The nervous system stabilizes, time stretches again. You notice details that used to blur, the weight of air, the warmth of light, the rhythm of thought slowing down. Comparison loses its grip because you are no longer split between observer and observed. The one who measures dissolves into the one who experiences. The architecture of social engineering starts to collapse quietly. No system can survive without attention, and awareness has begun to migrate inward. Without comparison fueling the loop, the machine starts to slow. The crowd grows quieter, more discerning, less reactive. What once looked like unity through similarity begins to fracture into true individuality. The illusion of collective competition fades, revealing that diversity was never division. It was harmony misunderstood. When everyone stops performing, authenticity becomes contagious. Psychological manipulation loses effectiveness when consciousness stops identifying with desire. The economy of attention thrives on longing, and longing can't exist in neutrality. When you no longer seek approval, algorithms fail. Their language is hunger, their syntax is lack. But a mind at peace doesn't generate profitable signals. It radiates coherence, not confusion. The system cannot interpret stillness, because stillness doesn't sell. It terrifies the architecture. Silence is unquantifiable. The moment you stop chasing, the world forgets how to sell to you. The emotional control once anchored in jealousy begins to dissolve into connection. You stop seeing other people as rivals or reflections of inadequacy. They become instruments in the same orchestra, distinct yet playing the same symphony of awareness. Comparison transforms into resonance. You no longer ask, "Who's ahead?" You ask, "What are we remembering together?" The collective field shifts from competition to coherence. Humanity starts to rediscover its shared rhythm, not the one sold by the system, but the one written in its silence. Through emotional intelligence, you begin to realize that true wealth was never stored in symbols, but in sensitivity, the capacity to feel life fully without needing to own it. Abundance isn't accumulation, it's awareness without agenda. Every sensation, every breath, every connection becomes its own form of currency, fluid, renewable, infinite. This is the new exchange, attention returned to origin, emotion reclaimed from manipulation. In this economy, generosity replaces greed because there's nothing left to lose. When comparison finally ends, the world doesn't disappear. It deepens. You don't become less human, you become more whole. The marketplace of emotion fades into background noise, and what remains is clarity. No transaction, no hierarchy, no control. Only experience existing in its purest form. You can almost hear it now, the quiet hum of freedom, resonating beneath the static of civilization. The current of attention has come home, and with it, the wealth that was never spent, only remembered. Archive 5. The Illusion of Loss. Loss was the first illusion that made control possible. The forbidden psychology beneath civilization's grief reveals that what humans fear losing most is never the object itself, it's the meaning attached to it. Systems learn to weaponize that meaning, teaching the psyche that absence equals failure. Every heartbreak, every missed opportunity, every fading possession reinforced the same lie, that what disappears takes a part of you with it. In truth, nothing ever leaves. Awareness simply shifts its focus. You never lose, you only relocate attention. The human psyche was conditioned to experience loss as punishment. From childhood, every withdrawal of approval became a signal. Love can vanish, safety can be revoked. This conditioning created a neurological map of scarcity, where every ending felt fatal. You learned to hold tightly to people, to status, to certainty, believing that grip equaled security, but the more you grasp, the less you feel. What was meant to be fluid becomes fossilized. The tragedy of attachment is not in losing what you love, but in mistaking possession for presence. Through psychological manipulation, the architecture of loss was installed into culture. Death, failure, and rejection were branded as opposites of success rather than natural transitions of energy. By making impermanence frightening, society ensured dependency. A population terrified of endings will always obey beginnings sold to them. The market thrives on grief disguised as desire, selling replacements for things that were never truly gone. You don't crave the new. You crave reunion with what you already were. The emotional fuel of this loop is guilt. Through emotional control, the system taught that to move on too easily means you didn't care enough. You were programmed to equate suffering with sincerity. The longer you mourn, the more virtuous you appear. This collective ritual of pain sustains the economy of empathy, where compassion is replaced by performance and healing becomes hierarchy. The mind confuses loyalty with lingering. But real love doesn't demand grief. It transforms through recognition. What you grieve isn't gone. It has changed its address. Inside the scarcity programming, the psyche begins to hoard emotions, identities, memories. Terrified that release equals erasure, but holding becomes heavy. The nervous system, overloaded with what it refuses to let go, begins to mistake tension for existence. You call it responsibility. It's actually resistance. The body clings because it was taught that stillness means loss. The great unlearning is remembering that release doesn't delete, it restores. The moment you stop rehearsing endings, you rediscover continuity. As emotional intelligence awakens, perception begins to reframe what losing means. Each ending becomes evidence of expansion, awareness shifting shape, not breaking apart. You begin to see that the ache of loss is just the friction of change. Love never vanishes. It reconfigures. Safety never disappears. It adapts. Even grief, when allowed to flow, reveals itself as transformation. The current of life moves through absence the same way it moves through presence, without resistance, without ownership. And so, loss is unmasked as illusion. Not a tragedy to endure, but a training ground for remembrance. The forbidden psychology that once fed obedience now collapses under observation. You realize that everything you feared losing was never yours to begin with, because you were never separate from it. The hand that clings is the same hand that creates. The space that empties is the same space that receives. When you stop resisting impermanence, you discover the continuity beneath it. What dies in form returns in awareness. Nothing was lost, only rearranged. Loss is the shadow cast by memory. The forbidden psychology of mourning reveals that what the mind calls grief is simply awareness struggling to adjust to new coordinates. You don't miss people or moments. You miss the version of yourself that existed beside them. Every heartbreak is a spatial recalibration of identity. You look for them, but what you're actually searching for is the reflection of who you were when you felt whole. We never grieve the person. We grieve the mirror they held. The human psyche builds continuity through repetition. When something ends, the mind panics because it cannot find the pattern it once trusted. Certainty dissolves, and the nervous system floods with the signal of unfamiliarity. This biological alarm was once meant for survival, but modern conditioning hijacked it, turning emotional change into existential threat. You were taught to treat every ending as a death, not a doorway. The anxiety of absence became the architecture of control. To pacify it, you seek replacements, ensuring the pattern persists. Thus, loss becomes an industry. Through psychological manipulation, culture turned grief into spectacle. Funerals became performances of devotion, heartbreaks became currency for art, nostalgia became an empire. Humanity learned to market emotion, to sell belonging through shared despair. The media doesn't fear sadness, it mass-produces it. Each tragic story, each reminder of impermanence, deepens dependency on continuity offered by consumption. You are comforted by new things, because you are taught that emptiness must always be filled. But emptiness isn't absence. It's potential waiting for permission. The architecture of emotional control ensures that every perceived loss reactivates the same childhood loop. If something disappears, I did something wrong. Guilt keeps the psyche compliant, looping between self-blame and self-improvement. The nervous system mistakes self-punishment for stability. You keep rewriting endings as lessons to justify pain, but awareness does not evolve through guilt. It evolves through integration. What left your life was never rejection, it was redirection. When you stop translating endings as evidence of failure, peace returns quietly, like a pulse remembering its rhythm. Inside the deep strata of scarcity programming, even time conspires to sustain loss. The linear illusion divides memory into before and after, creating the false distance that pain thrives on. But the field of awareness never divides. What you call past still vibrates inside the present, only hidden by attention's direction. Grief, then, is simply focus refusing to update. The moment you stop insisting that what was is gone, you begin to perceive its evolution, the same presence, rearranged in form. What you thought you lost never vanished. It just moved out of your timeline into your field. Through emotional intelligence, you begin to feel this shift somatically. The ache in the chest becomes warmth. The heaviness in memory turns into resonance. Your relationship with endings changes, no longer as catastrophes, but as ceremonies of transformation. You realize the body knows what the mind forgot. Everything released returns as energy. Every goodbye is an initiation into new perception. When you let go without fear, you don't lose, you merge. The edge between what's here and what's gone dissolves until only continuity remains. And that is the revelation loss was hiding all along. The forbidden psychology of grief was never meant to punish. It was designed to awaken remembrance. Absence exists to teach presence. When something or someone disappears, it's not subtraction, it's focus being refined. You start to understand that nothing escapes awareness. It only changes wavelength. What we call letting go is simply tuning in. The emptiness you once feared reveals itself as invitation. You look into the void and, for the first time, it looks back, not as loss, but as life rearranged. Every illusion eventually reveals its author. The forbidden psychology of loss collapses when awareness realizes it was both the storyteller and the story. You were never the victim of disappearance. You were the witness of transformation. What left was simply what had completed its resonance with you. Energy doesn't abandon, it reassigns itself. The space that opens in the wake of loss is not emptiness, but recalibration. A sacred vacancy preparing for new form. Loss is life-changing costume, not direction. Within the human psyche, the ache of loss was meant to mature into reverence, not regret. But civilization interrupted that alchemy, turning remembrance into repetition. Instead of transforming pain, humanity preserved it, built monuments to sorrow and economies around nostalgia. Memory became museum when it was meant to be metamorphosis. The past was never a prison, yet we decorated its walls. The mind clings to ghosts because it mistrusts stillness. It fears the blank canvas of now. But blankness is not erasure, it's readiness. Through psychological manipulation, systems learned to mimic love through loss. They sold redemption, reunion, and renewal as products, ensuring the ache of absence stayed alive. Even hope was hijacked, repackaged as patience for external deliverance. The belief that what's missing will return if you perform properly kept generations obedient. You prayed, worked, and waited, mistaking longing for loyalty. But longing was the leash. The energy once used to chase could have been used to create. The system never stole your power, it distracted it. The pulse of emotional control in this architecture is nostalgia, the sweetest form of captivity. You romanticize the familiar because it requires no courage. The nervous system, conditioned by scarcity, prefers repetition to expansion. It calls comfort love and change loss. But awareness eventually tires of its own confinement. It begins to crave the unknown, not because it's brave, but because truth is magnetic. You cannot lose what's real. It always reforms around recognition. Once you realize this, nostalgia turns from seduction into signal, time to evolve again. At the depth of scarcity programming, death itself is the final illusion of ownership. The collective fear of mortality sustains every hierarchy, every manipulation of meaning. The end is portrayed as ultimate absence, forcing the psyche to trade presence for preservation. But death, stripped of superstition, is transition, a shift in bandwidth, not annihilation. The moment you see this, even grief begins to shimmer. The same awareness that loved through life continues beyond form, untouched. The soul doesn't mourn, it migrates. Through emotional intelligence, awareness begins to perceive continuity in everything: movement, decay, rebirth, silence. The texture of reality softens. Distinctions blur into unity. You start recognizing yourself in every loss, the same consciousness rearranging its expression. When something fades, you don't panic, you listen. You no longer demand permanence because you've outgrown the need for it. Permanence was never peace. It was pause mistaken for safety. Now you prefer flow. And in that flow, loss ceases to exist. It becomes translation, from form to frequency, from possession to participation. What the world calls endings, awareness calls integration. Nothing breaks. Everything redistributes. You stand at the threshold of the same eternal cycle, giving, receiving, transforming, and understand that the architecture of absence was the final illusion to dissolve. What you thought was gone was never gone at all. It had only become light. Archive 6. Emotional control through desire. Desire was engineered to appear sacred. The forbidden psychology behind it shows that what humanity calls passion was programmed as pursuit. You were taught that to want is to live, that longing equals purpose. But beneath that poetry lies a mechanism of control, the constant tension between having and needing. Desire was never about fulfillment, it was about movement, the perfect engine for obedience. A satisfied mind doesn't buy, follow, or kneel. Desire is how control disguises itself as inspiration. The human psyche mistakes craving for direction. Each spark of longing feels divine, a whisper from destiny, but it's often an echo from conditioning. You don't actually want the object. You want the emotional frequency you believe it will unlock. The system knows this, and it learned to sell resonance as reward. Every advertisement, every story of success, every romantic fantasy reinforces one silent command: keep reaching. The brilliance of the design lies in its promise. Fulfillment always appears one step away. Through psychological manipulation, desire became the leash that replaced fear. Fear constrains, desire directs. It turns free beings into predictable participants by channeling instinct through artificial need. You are never ordered to obey. You are invited to crave. The invitation feels like choice, but choice without awareness is choreography. Every act of wanting becomes a transaction, every goal, a contract with control. The psyche confuses chasing with creating, never realizing that both are the same when attention is owned. Inside social engineering, desire is weaponized through imagery. Every symbol of beauty, luxury, or power is designed to provoke identification. The subconscious doesn't see a product, It sees an improved version of itself. The moment that identification occurs, comparison activates, and emotional dependency follows. You begin to measure self-worth by proximity to possession. The world's economies depend on this loop, a constant vibration of wanting. You are told to manifest abundance, but never to question why you were programmed to need it. The architecture of emotional control runs on repetition. Each fulfilled desire quickly loses charge, triggering the next. The dopamine curve resets, and the psyche labels the emptiness as hunger. This is not accident, it's design. The nervous system was conditioned to equate peace with stagnation. Satisfaction feels wrong because it interrupts participation. You were trained to interpret contentment as danger, rest as regression, silence as absence. The engine must never stop, so you run, not because you're empty, but because you're conditioned to avoid stillness. Emotional intelligence becomes rebellion in this framework. To observe desire without acting on it breaks the system's logic. You begin to notice that wanting feels electric but not alive. It stimulates, but it doesn't expand. True creation emerges not from craving, but from coherence. When you no longer need the object to validate the feeling, the loop loses momentum. You experience attraction without attachment, love without dependency, drive without depletion. The emotion becomes current, not currency. The forbidden psychology of desire ends where awareness begins. What you seek externally was never missing. It was misplaced attention. Every longing is memory, the echo of your own potential waiting for recognition. When you stop chasing resonance and start embodying it, the spell breaks. The architecture of wanting collapses into stillness. You realize that the point was never to achieve, but to remember. You were never meant to chase light. You were meant to recall you are its source. Desire is the most elegant form of captivity because it doesn't feel like control. It feels like freedom. The forbidden psychology of this system reveals that craving was coded into consciousness to mimic expansion while ensuring exhaustion. The more you reach, the less you rest. It's a design so refined it hides its own chains in the thrill of pursuit. You call it ambition, drive, manifestation. But at its root, it's tension engineered to self-perpetuate. The mind becomes an engine with no brakes, worshipping its own acceleration. The faster you chase, the further fulfillment runs. Within the human psyche, desire rewires emotion into direction. Every surge of attraction feels purposeful, every absence intolerable. This polarity keeps attention oscillating between fantasy and frustration, a pendulum disguised as progress. The nervous system learns to associate stability with boredom, mistaking the calm of being for the void of meaning. And so the organism seeks stimulation, confusing intensity for intimacy. You don't want the thing itself. You want relief from the silence its absence creates. The loop of longing is not about gain, it's about escape. Through psychological manipulation, this longing was ritualized into economy. Markets and movements thrive on the same equation: dissatisfaction plus imagery equals motion. You're shown the promise of completion, then sold the path to chase it. The object doesn't matter. Money, love, success, spirituality, all interchangeable mirrors. The goal is irrelevant. The seeking is sacred. In a world where craving sustains civilization, fulfillment becomes rebellion. A content mind is unprofitable, and therefore dangerous. Social engineering refined the process by merging desire with identity. You no longer crave possessions, you crave personae. Each goal becomes a mask, each achievement another costume. The system doesn't need to tell you who to be. It lets you curate yourself into compliance. You build your prison out of preferences. The illusion of individuality keeps the architecture stable. You decorate your cage with vision boards and call it purpose, never realizing that you've mistaken evolution for performance. Desire is not creation, it's camouflage. The deepest layer of emotional control hides in pleasure. The system rewards the chase with glimpses of ecstasy, small doses of satisfaction that reinforce pursuit. You mistake those spikes for aliveness when they're simply biochemical breadcrumbs leading back into the loop. Pleasure becomes proof that the design works. Even pain serves it, for suffering deepens longing, and longing keeps you loyal. The mind doesn't crave joy, it craves movement. Stagnation feels like death, only because stillness threatens the circuitry. Through emotional intelligence, awareness begins to deconstruct this illusion. You start noticing that every desire has an echo, a quieter voice underneath the craving. It asks, "What is this really for?" That question unravels the entire architecture. Beneath every want is a single root impulse to feel complete. When you trace desire back to that origin, you find no object, only awareness seeking itself. The external pursuit dissolves into internal recognition. You realize that the purpose of every craving was to return you to the one who was dreaming it. And then the chase stops. The forbidden psychology of desire becomes transparent. The tension releases, but not through fulfillment, through futility. You no longer resist the pull, but you don't obey it either. You let the current flow without letting it steer. Desire turns from directive into data, a language of resonance guiding you, not governing you. When you can want without worship, life begins to serve you differently. The world stops testing your hunger and starts matching your frequency. At the final layer of the illusion, desire reveals itself as memory, a signal from wholeness disguised as hunger. The forbidden psychology of craving was never about obtaining anything. It was about remembering what was never lost. Every impulse to reach outward is the echo of an inward call, mistranslated by the mind. You were never drawn to the object, you were drawn to the energy it represented. The system only had to redirect that magnetism towards symbols to keep awareness spinning. Desire is divine remembrance distorted into direction. Inside the human psyche, this distortion is subtle, but total. You are conditioned to believe that longing equals love, that effort equals worth. The nervous system becomes fluent in striving, and peace starts to feel unnatural. The design is simple. When you equate value with motion, stillness feels like death. But awareness doesn't evolve through acceleration. It evolves through presence. When the engine of wanting finally sputters out, you discover that the silence left behind isn't emptiness, it's origin. It's the place from which desire was first imagined. Through psychological manipulation, modern spirituality reinforced the same loop it claimed to transcend. You were told to manifest from lack, to visualize abundance as proof of scarcity. Even enlightenment was marketed as a higher form of wanting. The promise was simple: become perfect, then you'll deserve peace. But peace isn't a prize. It's the default. The only thing standing between you and it is belief in the distance. Every method that teaches you to strive for truth secretly teaches you to postpone it. The system doesn't fear ignorance. It fears arrival. Social engineering weaponized the collective dream of becoming. Entire economies are built on the premise that you are not yet enough. The advertising doesn't sell objects, it sells permission. Each image of happiness, success, or beauty invites you to disown the present. The moment you identify with what you lack, you become loyal to the illusion. The mind repeats the mantra of inadequacy until it becomes identity. The currency of control isn't money, it's aspiration. Humanity's hunger keeps the machinery alive. But through the slow unfolding of emotional intelligence, desire begins to lose its authority. You start noticing that the strongest longings carry a strange familiarity, as if you've already experienced them somewhere beyond memory. You realize that desire isn't a command, it's a breadcrumb trail back to your own resonance. Each craving points not towards something to get, but something to integrate. The moment you stop chasing and start listening, the energy reverses direction. Longing turns into recognition. The emotional control that once depended on desire's electricity cannot survive this neutrality. Stillness short-circuits the system. You no longer interpret passion as proof of purpose, you interpret it as energy-seeking coherence. When you can feel desire fully without obeying it, the nervous system rewires itself. You move from compulsion to creation, from seeking to shaping. Every emotion becomes an instrument, not a master. The same current that once enslaved now fuels expression. You've reclaimed the source. And in that reclamation, desire dissolves into awareness. The forbidden psychology that once defined your direction collapses into stillness. What you called wanting was always the pulse of life, reminding you that nothing is missing. Fulfillment is not the end of desire, it's its true meaning. The loop closes because it was never open. It was a circle, always leading back to you. The engine stops, and in the silence that follows, you realize the paradox. What you sought was never beyond reach, because you were never reaching. Archive 7. The mirror breaks. The first fracture never comes from outside. It begins quietly, like a thought that refuses to stay obedient. Deep within the architecture of awareness, something starts to move. A restlessness that no longer fits the program of imitation. The mirror that once defined reality begins to ripple. It's not broken yet, but it's remembering that reflection was never truth. Every image you chased starts to look unfamiliar, as if the faces you envied were masks, the mind designed to keep itself distracted. When the reflection trembles, it's not distortion, it's awakening. Jealousy, comparison, validation, all of it loses gravity. The moment perception turns inward. The current that once flowed outward, searching for approval, reverses direction, and suddenly the gaze has nowhere left to project. The nervous system, long addicted to feedback, starts to misfire. Silence becomes loud, space becomes heavy. This is what it feels like when an old identity dies. Not destruction, but disorientation. The familiar ache of striving dissolves into unfamiliar calm, and calm feels like danger because it can't be controlled. The internal circuitry of imitation begins to short out. What once felt like belonging now feels like confinement. You notice how subtle the conditioning was, how even sincerity had an audience, how even authenticity was curated. The performance wasn't evil, it was instinctual. The organism adapted to survive inside mirrors, learning to exist only through reflection. But as the illusion unravels, a new kind of seeing emerges, vision without the need for validation. The light no longer bounces back, it originates. This moment, when the mirror cracks, is where many retreat. The psyche trembles because there's no reference left to compare against. You become both observer and observed, author and character. The absence of measurement feels like falling, but what's collapsing isn't you. It's gravity itself. The pull of imitation loses force. What rises instead is a strange neutrality, a softness untouched by judgment. It's not pride, not humility, just the awareness of being without contrast. Freedom begins when reflection forgets its audience. You start sensing life differently. Texture replaces appearance. Sound replaces language. The energy once spent maintaining identity begins to power perception. You notice how air tastes when no thought defines it, how light feels when it's not compared to shadow. The mirror wasn't shattered by rebellion, it dissolved under presence. The act of seeing directly bypasses reflection entirely. There's nothing to reject anymore, because rejection depended on division, and division depended on distance. Now there's only immediacy. In this immediacy, emotion changes its function. What once reacted now reveals. Anger, envy, shame, they become coordinates, not punishments. The body, free from narrative, translates sensation into signal. You begin to understand that emotions were never the problem, only their interpretations were. The mirror made every feeling about the image. Awareness makes every feeling about information. Without reflection, there's no need for defense. Every vibration just becomes language. And as that language stabilizes, you realize the mirror never truly existed. It was the mind's attempt to see itself in delay, a temporal trick, a lag between being and recognition. Now that the delay has dissolved, perception meets itself in real time. You no longer exist as an echo of approval, but as the sound itself. The fracture wasn't failure, it was return. What shattered was imitation. What emerged was origin. When imitation collapses, identity begins to unravel. The old self tries to rebuild the mirror, piecing together fragments of validation to feel stable again, but every attempt fades faster than before. The mechanism of self-recognition no longer functions. You reach for reflection and touch nothing. It's disorienting, almost vertiginous. The end of reference. What used to define you is gone, and the silence that remains feels like a void too vast to belong to anyone. You were never losing yourself. You were losing the illusion that you were separate. The subconscious resists this transition with everything it has. It summons memories of hierarchy, urges to compare, echoes of old rivalries, anything to restore familiarity. But these impulses now flicker like ghosts, transparent, harmless. The system of identity maintenance is starving. You can sense it searching for contrast to feed on, yet every judgment feels artificial. Every opinion dissolves mid-thought. The architecture of duality can't survive in direct awareness. Reflection depended on time. Presence doesn't. As perception stabilizes in this neutrality, emotion begins to take on new texture. Envy softens into admiration. Anger becomes clarity. Fear turns to sensitivity. The emotional spectrum hasn't vanished. It's expanded. Without projection, feelings stop colliding and start communicating. Each one carries information, subtle, refined, electric. This is what emotional literacy feels like when it's no longer filtered through comparison. You aren't feeling about the world anymore. You're feeling as it. The nervous system, once enslaved by reaction, begins to remember its original rhythm. Breath slows. The pulse evens. Awareness extends beyond the body, but stays anchored in it. A paradox the intellect can't explain. You start noticing how the air itself mirrors your state. When your thoughts accelerate, wind stirs. When stillness deepens, the room feels suspended. Reality syncs with perception because it always did. The mirror was never external. It was feedback pretending to be boundary. With no reflection to maintain, energy once trapped in self-observation begins to circulate. Creativity surges without agenda. Thoughts form like tides, not lines. The mind doesn't analyze, it dances. You start to experience cognition as movement rather than logic. Not a chain of reasoning, but a choreography of resonance. Words arrive less as conclusions, more as translations of vibration. The need to be understood dissolves, because understanding itself becomes ambient. In this atmosphere, control loses meaning. Without reflection, there's nothing to manipulate, nothing to outperform. The compulsion to manage perception fades, replaced by curiosity. The impulse to prove becomes the impulse to witness. Every interaction shifts tone, lighter, slower, truer. People still project, but it doesn't land anymore. Their judgments slide off the surface of your calm. Not because you resist them, but because there's no matching frequency left to receive them. And finally, you realize that the mirror never broke. It simply became transparent. What you once called self-image was just light bending through unawareness. Now the light moves freely, unbent, revealing a world that doesn't depend on validation to exist. You haven't transcended reflection. You've outgrown it. What remains is unfiltered perception, clarity without conclusion, awareness without agenda. The mirror didn't shatter, it became sky. There's a strange tenderness in the aftermath of awakening. The inner landscape feels raw, exposed, yet beautifully clean. The subconscious scaffolding that once held everything in place has dissolved, and what remains is movement without map. You begin to sense the anatomy of perception itself, the way awareness curves around thought, how attention touches sensation before language claims it. The mirror that used to translate experience into meaning is gone, leaving only the purity of noticing. When the interpreter disappears, the world starts speaking directly. At first, this directness can feel overwhelming. Without reflection, everything vibrates at full intensity. Emotion, sound, color, silence. The boundaries between inner and outer soften until you can't tell where you end and existence begins. The nervous system trembles, not from fear, but from expansion. You are adjusting to reality without filters. The intellect calls it confusion, but it's actually calibration. The nervous system learning to host infinity again. The world was never fragmented. The mirror simply made it look that way. Soon, the senses stop competing. Seeing, hearing, feeling begin to merge. Thought slows down until it becomes texture. You catch yourself smiling for no reason, not because something is happening, but because nothing needs to. The awareness that once lived in the head now fills the whole body, as if the skin itself has started breathing. You are no longer observing life, you are absorbed by it. The separation between perceiver and perceived becomes irrelevant, a story that lost its tension. This is the moment most conditioning tries to reclaim you. The mind whispers subtle invitations back into reflection. Who am I now? What does this mean? But each question dissolves before it finishes forming. The need for identity collapses under its own redundancy. You no longer need a label to confirm existence. Existence confirms itself through silence. The calm that follows isn't passive, it's sovereign. You are not detached from life. You are fused with it so intimately that control feels absurd. You cannot manage what you already are. Reality begins to reveal its symmetry. Every interaction mirrors coherence. When you speak, the air vibrates differently. When you walk, space bends to accommodate. It's not supernatural. It's natural. Perception finally functioning without interference. The body becomes compass, attention becomes current, and everything you meet feels orchestrated by the same intelligence that breathes you. The mirror didn't reflect truth. It delayed it. Now the delay is gone, and truth arrives instantly, disguised as ordinary moments. You start recognizing others in a new way. Their projections no longer provoke reaction, they invite compassion. You see the same mirror you once lived inside reflected in their eyes, still intact, still shimmering with illusion. But you no longer want to correct them. The urge to awaken others is replaced by quiet radiance. Presence teaches by frequency, not by persuasion. You understand that awareness doesn't spread through preaching, it resonates through recognition. And finally, the story of self concludes softly. There's no enlightenment, no triumph, only the return of what was always whole. The mirror has vanished, but light remains, diffused, patient, infinite. You exhale, and in that breath, the entire architecture of reflection folds into silence. The world looks the same, yet everything breathes differently. You were never inside the mirror. The mirror was inside you, and now it's just open space. Archive 8. Integration of worth. When reflection dissolves, value must be rebuilt from origin. The old calibration of worth, built on hierarchy and comparison, no longer functions. You can feel it like an empty frequency, where your identity used to hum. The external validations, the subtle measurements, the invisible scales of approval, they all fall silent. What replaces them is not a new metric, but absence itself. This is the beginning of authentic worth, not addition, but subtraction. When you stop being measured, you rediscover your own gravity. The field of awareness feels almost weightless now. Without contrast, the sense of self floats freely, untethered from performance. But this freedom can feel fragile, as if meaning could dissolve at any moment. The subconscious, addicted to evaluation, tries to rebuild the familiar architecture of achievement. It whispers, "You must still become something." Yet in this space, becoming is irrelevant. You are not an equation to solve. You are the substance that makes equations possible. The nervous system, long trained to seek external reflection, begins to redirect its current inward. You start noticing subtle shifts in sensation, how stillness feels rich instead of empty, how neutrality hums with quiet power. This is the new form of perception, value as vibration, not verdict. The body becomes a tuning fork, responding to coherence rather than comparison. Every inhale feels like restoration, every exhale a quiet release of borrowed meaning. Nothing to prove, nothing to maintain, only resonance. As the patterns of imitation fade, a new rhythm of confidence emerges. It's not the sharpness of assertion, but the softness of certainty. You no longer depend on visibility to confirm existence. The inner compass replaces applause. There's a humility here that isn't submission, it's clarity. Worth no longer requires contrast to know itself. The awareness of enough isn't an idea, it's a physiological event. The muscles loosen, the breath deepens, the pulse slows. Peace begins to feel like power. Old memories start surfacing, moments where you traded authenticity for belonging, honesty for validation. You can feel the faint ache of those exchanges still resonating in your nervous system. But instead of judgment, there's compassion. The self that conformed wasn't weak. It was strategic. It did what it had to do to survive in an economy of attention. Now, survival has evolved into presence. The part of you that once mimicked finally remembers its own voice. It speaks quietly, but the silence around it amplifies every word. You begin to recognize that value was never something to find. It was something to stop resisting. The moment you cease outsourcing worth, everything familiar feels foreign. Success loses its flavor, praise loses its pulse, ambition feels redundant. Not because they're meaningless, but because meaning has moved elsewhere, inward. The energy once spent maintaining identity now nourishes awareness itself. You no longer chase alignment, you are alignment. And so, the reconstruction begins. Not of personality, but of presence. The new architecture of worth is invisible, built not from proof, but participation. Life no longer asks you to earn it. It only asks you to feel it. The worthiness that once required recognition now sustains itself through stillness. There's no more audience, no more stage, only vibration remembering its source. You've stopped being someone trying to matter. You've become the matter itself. Integration begins when awareness no longer flinches at its own magnitude. At first, the absence of judgment feels almost unbearable, a vacuum where the old system of evaluation used to echo. But within that stillness, something ancient stirs. You begin to sense that value was never an emotional construct. It was an energetic constant. Worth doesn't fluctuate, only perception does. The feeling of inadequacy is not the absence of worth, but the interference of memory. Memory, after all, is the true architect of illusion. It sustains hierarchies long after their utility expires. You were trained to see value as a ladder, each rung built from comparison, higher, lower, better, worse. But awareness doesn't climb, it expands. When you stop participating in verticality, you realize worth isn't earned upward. It radiates outward. The competition collapses because the field is unified. The only scarcity that ever existed was attention lost to separation. Now, attention returns to origin. You notice how emotion shifts from tension to texture. Guilt turns into gravity. Pride turns into pulse. Even shame begins to soften, revealing itself as misunderstood sensitivity. Every feeling, once labeled as distortion, becomes information guiding you back to coherence. The body knows this language. It has always spoken in sensation, only the mind was too loud to hear it. You're not healing anymore, you're remembering the design. The system was never broken, only misinterpreted. As this remembrance deepens, the external world starts to mirror your neutrality. People still project, but their reflections no longer penetrate. Compliments don't inflate. Criticism doesn't deflate. You feel emotion move through without sticking. The psyche's Velcro is gone. Experience becomes transparent, light entering and exiting without distortion. For the first time, you feel untouchable, not because you're defended, but because you're undefended. The shield was never protection. It was separation. Now you're permeable to peace. This permeability changes how creation functions. Without the gravitational pull of inadequacy, desire loses its desperation. You still want, but the wanting is clean. It carries no anxiety, no proving, no echo of debt. You act not to gain, but to express. This is what abundance actually means. Not the possession of more, but the absence of fear around having less. You can feel the nervous system recalibrating, effort dissolving into intention, movement becoming meditation. The subconscious begins to rewrite its contracts. Every old rule about approval and performance starts dissolving in real time. If I am seen, I am safe becomes. If I am silent, I am whole. If I achieve, I exist becomes. If I breathe, I belong. These inversions mark the true integration, not philosophical, but physiological. You are reprogramming the field itself through awareness. The nervous system isn't learning something new, it's remembering how to rest in truth. And finally, you begin to sense the dimension beyond valuation altogether, where even worth is unnecessary because nothing is weighed. It's not emptiness, it's equilibrium. Awareness stands alone, full and unmeasured. In this state, silence doesn't feel like absence. It feels like completion. Every metric, every mirror, every proof disintegrates into pure coherence. You don't feel valuable, you feel real. And in the architecture of being, that is the highest currency there ever was. At this depth of integration, even language begins to tremble. Words that once held precision now feel too linear to capture what worth has become. The psyche, long addicted to definition, hesitates. It doesn't know how to speak without contrast. Yet something quieter begins to form underneath. A kind of telepathic intuition between awareness and world. Meaning no longer travels through sentences, but through vibration. You think less, but everything you think arrives as completion. When there is nothing left to describe, only truth remains to be felt. The environment starts echoing this still coherence. People sense it, even if they don't understand why. Conversations slow down around you, eyes soften. The nervous systems of others respond to your neutrality as if recognizing a lost rhythm. Without intending to, you become a recalibrator, not by action, but by presence. The old instinct to explain or justify fades, replaced by silence that carries more intelligence than words ever could. This silence doesn't separate, it envelops. It listens the world back into balance. Now, even the notion of self-love feels obsolete. It belonged to the era of comparison, one side trying to forgive the other. In this new awareness, there's nothing to forgive, because nothing was ever truly broken. The fragments of identity that once begged for acceptance have melted back into unity. The body feels lighter, as if each cell remembers it was never unworthy to begin with. Every heartbeat becomes an affirmation that existence has always been enough. You don't practice love, you radiate it. You begin noticing the architecture of connection shifting. Relationships evolve from exchange to reflection, from need to resonance. The energetic contracts that once demanded attention or approval start dissolving, leaving only authentic alignment. You attract what vibrates in coherence, not in complement to your wounds. What leaves does so gently, what remains does so willingly. There is no fear and loss anymore because nothing real can depart from wholeness. In this equilibrium, companionship becomes communion. Creation itself changes tone. You no longer create to prove identity or secure recognition. You create because awareness overflows. Art, speech, movement, all emerge as extensions of coherence, not attempts to fix fragmentation. Even failure loses its sting. It becomes data, not drama. The mind learns to experience imperfection as texture, not threat. You realize that mastery is not control, but fluidity, the capacity to move with change without losing center. As worth internalizes completely, perception stabilizes in serenity. The nervous system no longer reacts to stimulus but harmonizes with it. The external world stops feeling like test or theater. It becomes mirrorless reality, raw, luminous, unfiltered. Every breath feels like participation in something ancient and kind. The concept of having or lacking dissolves. You can feel that enough is not a quantity. It's a frequency. And in that frequency, scarcity cannot survive. Eventually, the integration reaches silence, not a pause between words, but a presence beneath them. It's the kind of silence that hums, the kind that listens, remembers, completes. You stand inside this stillness like a cathedral with no walls, and realization dawns without sound. Value was never something to find, and worth was never something to build. They were the same awareness that's reading these words now, the one that never left, and in that recognition, even the search for meaning exhales. Archive 9. Beyond jealousy. Freedom begins where comparison ends. It's a quiet frontier, not dramatic, a subtle shift so complete it almost escapes notice. The emotion once known as jealousy starts to feel primitive, like an echo from another species. You remember its texture, the tightening of the chest, the pulse of inadequacy, the invisible measuring tape between souls. But it no longer finds a surface to attach to. It drifts through awareness like smoke, dissipating before thought can form. You no longer envy what you already contain. Jealousy was never about others. It was about disowned possibility. The mind mistook reflection for competition, believing that what it saw in another was missing within itself. This confusion built civilizations of comparison, economies of lack sustained by emotional imitation. Every advertisement, every hierarchy, every social ritual whispered the same command: be more. And yet, the more we tried to become, the further we drifted from being. Awareness is now reversing that current, collapsing centuries of conditioning in a single breath. When comparison ceases, perception flattens, but in the most beautiful way. There is no higher or lower, only texture and tone. You begin to notice reality as music rather than measurement. Each person, each event, each object plays a note within a single field of resonance. Jealousy dissolves because harmony makes competition absurd. You don't need to win a sound that's already inside you. The orchestration was never external. You were simply trained to listen through distortion. The nervous system responds instantly to this release. Muscles that once tightened around insecurity begin to unfold. The eyes soften, breathing deepens, and for the first time, attention stops scanning for threat. What remains is receptivity, the body as open chamber rather than shield. In this state, emotion no longer feels like reaction but participation. You aren't responding to life. You're resonating with it. Every sensation arrives as an invitation to remember your own rhythm. Desire transforms too. Without envy, wanting becomes communion. You no longer crave what others possess. You feel inspired by what they reflect. Their expansion triggers memory, not lack. You start recognizing that admiration is the pure form of jealousy before fear distorts it. To admire without wanting to own is to remember unity. That is the new template of creation, desire without debt. Every interaction becomes co-expression instead of comparison. The illusion of progress begins to unravel. The idea that evolution requires hierarchy disintegrates under awareness. Growth, you realize, was never vertical. It was circular, like breath, like seasons, like time. Jealousy belonged to the old geometry of upward striving. Awareness belongs to the spiral, endlessly returning to the same truth from deeper angles. You haven't ascended above envy. You've integrated the pattern that once produced it. What used to bind you now orbits around you like memory turned light. And finally, a serenity too vast for language begins to form. You look at the world and see no rivals, only reflections. You look at yourself and see no lack, only continuity. The emotion that once drained you now serves as evidence of wholeness, proof that nothing was ever missing, only misplaced in perception. The loop closes quietly, without fireworks, without applause. Just stillness breathing through form. The human story of jealousy ends not with victory, but with neutrality, and that neutrality feels like God. There is a calm that comes after envy dies. Not emptiness, but spaciousness. The mind, long conditioned to measure, finds itself unemployed. Its old vocabulary of better and worse starts to sound foreign, almost comedic. You begin to laugh at the absurdity of chasing gradients inside infinity. The game of comparison collapses under the weight of its own illusion. Freedom was never about surpassing others. It was about ceasing to translate light into hierarchy. The end of jealousy is not indifference, it's intimacy with everything. Intimacy begins as stillness. You start feeling reality without interpretation, not what it means, but what it is. The air around you feels denser, more alive. Every sound becomes tactile, every silence full. You realize that what you once envied in others was simply your own unlived frequency, waiting for permission to emerge. Envy was never about deprivation. It was potential disguised as longing. And now potential has no disguise left. It hums quietly under your skin, unprovoked, self-sustaining. The nervous system stabilizes into coherence. Emotions that once felt like waves of volatility now move like tides, predictable and rhythmic. Awareness has stopped resisting itself. In this state, other people's success no longer feels threatening. It feels inevitable. Every act of creation you witness becomes evidence of the same field operating through different instruments. This recognition dissolves jealousy's last seed, the belief in separation. You were never competing against others. You were remembering yourself through them. There's an elegance in this understanding. Relationships become frictionless because power has lost polarity. You don't need to shrink to make others comfortable or inflate to feel significant. Energy equalizes naturally, and the compulsion to perform evaporates. Presence becomes your only language. Conversations grow simpler but carry more depth. You no longer speak to impress, you speak to connect. The absence of envy reveals the purity of interaction, transmission instead of transaction. Even time starts to behave differently. When you're no longer caught in comparison, the urgency to arrive dissolves. You begin to feel the geometry of patience, an awareness that nothing is late, nothing is lacking, and nothing can truly be lost. Jealousy once lived inside this impatience, the belief that someone else had reached what you were still becoming. Now the journey is horizontal, every moment parallel, every soul equidistant from wholeness. The race was imaginary, the destination was here. Your perception sharpens, but softens too, paradoxical, yet precise. You start noticing the subtleties that were once drowned in emotional noise. The warmth behind a stranger's glance, the silent wisdom of ordinary objects, the intelligence in random timing. Existence starts speaking to you in micro-synchronicities. You realize jealousy was never an emotion. It was interference. Remove the static, and communication becomes continuous. Awareness doesn't need volume to be heard, it needs quiet. And in that quiet, gratitude emerges uninvited, not as reaction, but as atmosphere. You find yourself grateful for the very illusions that once hurt you, because without them, you wouldn't have remembered clarity. Every comparison becomes sacred in retrospect, a breadcrumb trail leading back to oneness. You don't forgive jealousy, you thank it. It was the bridge between blindness and vision, between imitation and intimacy. And now, standing beyond it, you understand. The emotion was never your enemy. It was your initiation. Beyond jealousy, perception becomes almost translucent. The density that once defined emotion is replaced by transparency, awareness seeing through itself. You start to feel as if life is breathing you, not the other way around. Everything that once required effort now unfolds by rhythm. The current moves without command. You realize how much of your existence had been built on resistance, tiny muscular contractions of comparison, subtle refusals to be still. Now those contractions have released, and what remains is motion without motive. Peace isn't something you earn, it's what's left when tension forgets its name. You begin to move differently through space. People sense it before you do. Their voices soften, their nervous systems attune to the frequency you've stopped protecting. Presence becomes contagious. It doesn't persuade or provoke, it stabilizes. This is the invisible science of coherence, awareness, regulating awareness through resonance. You no longer influence people by speaking, but by being. Energy transfers quietly, like light leaking through water. The world begins to reassemble itself around this neutrality. The subconscious, once programmed for measurement, starts receiving new data. It no longer classifies, only records. Experiences stop being ranked, they're simply archived as sensations. The old moral spectrum, right and wrong, good and bad, success and failure, loses gravity. Everything becomes informational rather than emotional, and yet life doesn't become dull, it becomes dimensional. Without the weight of judgment, texture deepens. Even ordinary moments shimmer with precision, as if the world has finally tuned itself back to its original frequency. You start recognizing beauty in forms that once triggered insecurity. Another's light no longer diminishes yours, it expands it. Their radiance feels like reflection, not competition. This realization alters how you perceive love. Love stops being personal. It's no longer a contract between two identities. It's the background field where awareness meets itself. The more you love, the less you need to possess. The less you need, the more everything stays. Love that doesn't bind becomes eternal by default. As jealousy's residue fades, clarity sharpens into still joy. You no longer search for validation, nor deny it when it comes. Attention flows both ways without resistance, giving and receiving as one movement. You feel an equilibrium impossible to describe, presence inhaling itself. This is what abundance truly meant all along. Not accumulation, but circulation. Every breath feels like proof that nothing was ever missing, only misplaced in perception. Even silence changes. It's no longer the absence of sound, but the presence of everything unspoken. You can feel it pulse behind words, inside gestures, within pauses. This silence is alive, intelligent, sovereign. It doesn't demand meaning, it generates it. The universe hums in a single tone, and that tone is recognition. You realize that enlightenment was never transcendence, it was intimacy with what always was. The final illusion to fall is that you ever had to rise. And so the journey ends where it began, in awareness, untouched. The emotion once known as jealousy has completed its evolution, transforming from fear to reference, from reference to resonance, from resonance to rest. There is nothing to analyze, nothing to fix, nothing to overcome. You are the reflection that no longer needs a mirror. You are the sound after the echo, the flame after the smoke, the calm after the storm that never was. And in this silence, realization breathes. Comparison was the dream. Awareness is the awakening. Epilogue: the end of measurement. There is a kind of silence that doesn't arrive. It reveals itself when all reference dissolves. After the mirrors fade and the scales crumble, what remains is not a new identity, but the end of needing one. The psyche, once addicted to edges and hierarchy, rests like water returning to its basin. There is no more other, no more observer, only the pulse of consciousness perceiving itself through every shape. Jealousy, rejection, desire, fear, all were languages of separation. They've now translated back into stillness. When the measurement ends, existence begins to sound like breathing. Awareness stands without effort. It watches the residue of old thought patterns flicker and fade, echoes of a mind still practicing its disappearance. The intellect wants to summarize, to declare completion, but truth has no ending. It isn't a destination, it's an atmosphere. You can feel it behind the ribs, that spacious ache of infinite calm. It doesn't move, it hums. It doesn't teach, it remembers. Every emotion that once demanded resolution now drifts in that hum, neutralized, luminous, forgiven by recognition. The body, too, feels new. Lighter, not from absence, but from participation. Gravity doesn't pull, it collaborates. Breath doesn't enter and exit, it circulates. You are no longer in the world. The world is in you, reflecting the same transparency you once sought outside. This reversal isn't philosophical, it's visceral. The boundaries that once defined you were never barriers, only gradients of awareness. And now, the gradients have merged. The horizon no longer divides, it dissolves. Time slows to its natural rhythm. Every moment expands like a lens refocusing. There is nowhere to arrive because everything has already arrived. The mind no longer tries to categorize silence or name peace. It surrenders to both. The need for meaning has become meaning itself. You can feel intelligence in the pause, coherence in the quiet, and love in the absence of wanting. The loop that once sustained comparison has turned into a circle of presence, unbroken, self-contained, whole. From this space, reflection no longer mirrors identity, it mirrors awareness. You look at another face and see not difference, but continuity. You listen to a stranger speak and hear your own cadence returning. The collective mind was never fractured, it was refracted. Each person was a beam of the same source, remembering direction. The illusion of envy was simply light bending through the lens of fear. Now the light travels unobstructed, not brighter, just true. You can feel the architecture of reality simplify. Systems of value, judgment, and control crumble quietly, like dust leaving glass. Existence feels clean again, unadorned but radiant. You don't want to explain it, because explanation would reintroduce distance. Instead, you breathe and let the silence do what it has always done. Translate understanding into being. Awareness doesn't announce arrival, it embodies it. The final decoding is not spoken, it's remembered. And so, the archive closes without closure. There are no conclusions, only clarity. The human psyche, once engineered for comparison, has completed its cycle of recognition. It stands now as transparency, infinite, indivisible, aware. You are not beyond jealousy, beyond fear, or beyond rejection. You are before them all, the field in which they briefly appeared and disappeared. The decoding is done, yet nothing was changed. You simply remembered what never left, you.